Welcome back to the SportsMax Zone, and we're starting with a huge story coming out of New Zealand in the past 18 hours or so. The West Indies preparation for the upcoming tour of New Zealand, set for the 27th of November to December the 15th, suffering a setback after the team was on Tuesday barred from training. The temporary block will be lifted on Friday. The decision came after members of the team were deemed to have broken COVID-19 quarantine protocols at their managed isolation facility in Christchurch. The New Zealand Health Ministry says it has video evidence and testimony from staff at the facility that some members of the Windies contingent were sharing food and socializing in the hallways of their government-approved hotel. Cricket West Indies were swift to comment on the matter, issuing the following statement. Part of it reads, "The CWI is in full support of the New Zealand Ministry of Health's position. The incidents in question included some players compromising the bubble integrity by mixing between two separate West Indies bubbles into which the touring party had been split by sharing food and socializing in hallways." Now, there is no evidence or suggestion that any member of the touring party left the facility or that any unauthorized person accessed it. New Zealand is one of few COVID-19 free countries in the world. The Windies had been granted special exemption to facilitate early training. Now, Chief Executive of Cricket West Indies, Johnny Graves, says the New Zealand authorities were right to temporarily suspend the training privilege.
It's fair to say that we are extremely disappointed that some of the players seem to have interacted with other members of their respective bubbles. We're certainly in full support of the action taken by the New Zealand Ministry of Health, which is that for the remaining part of the quarantine period, we will be unable to train. Clearly, with limited preparation due to COVID-19 protocols here in the Caribbean and in New Zealand, it's a huge blow to our preparation to have no training for the next 3 days. That said, I do want to stress that we are, as an organisation, in full support of the New Zealand Ministry of Health's position and the action that they've taken. And we have written to all the players a couple of hours ago, re-emphasising the importance of strictly following all of these protocols and the importance that they do that for their own health and safety and well-being, but also clearly to support the New Zealand government's aims and objective in keeping the New Zealand population COVID-free. So,
the posture of the CWI CEO, Johnny Grave, looking pretty embarrassed at this story. Joining us to comment on the issue, international cricket commentator Fazeer Mohammed, whose number one team, Liverpool, is suffering some injury concerns at the moment, and his number two team, West Indies, caught up in a story that is pretty embarrassing. Faz, your take on, first of all, the CWI's response to what has happened in New Zealand?
I like the prioritizing of the number one and the number two, Lance. But I'm trying to disentangle myself from Liverpool, but that's another story for another time. It is embarrassing because of all of the challenges. We are fully aware of how taxing it must be for young men, especially to be in an environment where they're basically cooped up for days on end. Of course, they had to endure that on the England tour. They did so quite well. Many of them were involved in a similar situation in the CPL, again, for weeks on end, and now to have to undergo the same situation in New Zealand. It will obviously take a toll, but you have to respect other people's rules. And New Zealand have been very successful in managing COVID-19, and quite clearly, the players were in violation. So we have to pay the price. The one bright light is that it will end on Friday. And already it's Thursday morning in New Zealand, approaching midday in New Zealand. So there's just another day and a bit to go through with this. So yes, it will affect the team's preparation and the fact that they can't train. But so long as no one tests positive between now and Friday, they will all be free to interact with everyone in the New Zealand public once they get the all clear on Friday.
I heard a radio talk show host talking earlier today, Faz, and he seemed infuriated by the fact that the West Indies players have been found to commit something, as far as he's concerned, so egregious when as far as he's concerned, they were tested before they left the Caribbean. They arrived in New Zealand, they tested as well. So what could be so bad about just mingling among themselves?
Well, you have to understand that the reason New Zealand have been so successful is that they have been so strict in monitoring the situation. Remember, Lance, at this point, only New Zealand nationals are allowed entry into New Zealand. And any non-nationals, as for example, this West Indies cricket team, they would have to get special dispensation to allow them to come into the country, because in the same way, for those who would have visited those countries, you've been to Australia a number of times, they are very, very strict when it comes to their quarantine procedures with fruit and vegetables and animals and so on. And in this case, with COVID-19, they don't mess around. So yes, it might sound to us on this side of the world as being unnecessarily harsh, but it's because of that very strict policy that has worked so well for them that another couple of days and the players would have been allowed to walk around in Queenstown or Dunedin or Auckland or Wellington, because they would have satisfied the 14-day requirement. They may still do so come Friday, but I think that's the reason why this is in place. And yes, it might seem unnecessarily picky, because the West Indies players generally have been disciplined and well-behaved in regards to this, but they will hold the position, New Zealand, that if they relax the rules for the West Indies, they'll have to relax it for everyone, and that could open them up to another wave of COVID-19 infections.
Faz, where do you stand with this statement coming from the CWI boss? Because earlier today I was in a discussion with one of my producers actually, and he was saying, it comes across like Johnny Grave is in full support of whatever New Zealand says. He used some very strong words as to being very disappointed with the Windies team. Do you feel like his words makes it seem as if, New Zealand has the upper hand?
Well, I don't think it's a case of upper hand, and I appreciate where it sounds as if we're almost begging for forgiveness for this situation, and I understand that, and I understand the context in which it is. Us as Caribbean people almost always seem to have to kowtow to the whims and the fancies of others. I get that, but I also appreciate the fact that, look, Johnny Grave is in a situation where, look, Cricket West Indies needs these tours. They can't afford for the tour to be called off. They can't afford for there to be a really serious violation, for someone to test positive within the group, and the entire tour has to be abandoned. Remember what happened to Jofra Archer during the West Indies series in England, where he broke the restrictions, went to his home after the first test and subsequently missed the second test match, and he had to face the fire for it. And again, it will come across as exceptionally harsh. It will come across as if Cricket West Indies are very, very contrite in these circumstances. But again, maybe it's about sending the message to the New Zealand cricket authorities, to Cricket New Zealand, that, look, we appreciate that our players may have messed up a bit, and please understand, maybe in the informal discussions, that, look, they've been coping with these bubble situations for quite some time. And I expect that there might have been some measure of a discourse unofficially in relation to this. But at the end of the day, it's Cricket West Indies who have to be responsible. And I don't think it came across as excessively apologetic. It was merely an acknowledgement that it was the West Indies players who committed the violations. And if it had gotten worse and someone had tested positive, the tour and therefore the revenue would have been in jeopardy.
So Faz, as you talk about calling off the tour, do you see, let's just say worst case scenario, and of course I by no means want this to happen, but a player tests positive for COVID-19, do you see with the stringent measures in place with New Zealand, do you see them calling off the tour?
Well, thankfully, no one has tested positive. And I think we need to make this clear. Even though players were seen meeting in corridors, mingling, therefore violating the two bubbles that were set up, no one has tested positive up to this point. And they've basically got 36 hours, again, to ensure that once more, no one tests positive. If someone does, though, then it becomes another consideration. Do they test and trace? Do they isolate the team for another 14 days? Because remember, we still have some time to go. Today is the 11th of November. We have another 16 days to go before the first T20 International. The players who have just completed the IPL, they will be in a matter of hours arriving in New Zealand, and they'll be in the bubble immediately and not out of it until 24 hours before that first T20 match is played in Auckland. So yes, there's always that possibility. That was the fair in England as well. if anyone in either group, West Indies or England, had tested positive, it would have obviously jeopardized the entire series. Let's hope that doesn't happen. And so far, all the players, for the various tests that they've done, they've tested negative.
Fazeer, I'm wondering about management. Oh, we're done? Yeah, Fazeer, I beg your pardon there was a break in transmission. I'm wondering about management here.
Yeah, I think, George, I think there's an issue with the audio here at the moment, and the microphones need to be sorted out.
No, that didn't look good. That didn't look good. That didn't look good at all.
Back with us on the SportsMax Zone. We apologize for the technical glitch which interfered with the interview we were having with Fazeer Mohammed, talking about the West Indies quarantine breach in New Zealand, which resulted in a temporary suspension of the training privileges for the team ahead of the first T20 of the tour, or on the tour of New Zealand, set for November 27. Fazeer, are you still with us? Right.
Yes, I believe I am.
Excellent, good. I was asking you about the reading of the situation from my perspective, rather troubling for some different reasons than have been covered so far. I'm wondering, why is it that the players have been put so squarely under the gun, as if to suggest that management, the team management there, did state explicitly to the players that notwithstanding the fact that you're all in a bubble, you've all been COVID-free so far, there can be no commingling any at all, especially in public spaces. Now, these players are players who are used to hotels, they are used to hotel lobbies, they know that cameras are everywhere because it's the same device of the camera that team management use from time to time to know that players are sneaking out late at night and coming back with paramours, or, well, paramours, multiples of them, you know what I mean. So I'm saying, for the players to be so freely in the hotel hallways, gathering and eating and talking and whatever, socializing, it would suggest to me as if perhaps the players did not know that even within the bubble among themselves, where they were all insulated from the outside factors which could compromise their health and safety, they did not know this, which is why they were in that position. And I'm wondering, how is it that the management that is there on the ground in New Zealand has escaped the upbraiding from the CEO of Cricket West Indies?
Well, I think that's why there's going to be an investigation into this process. Was it the fault of Roll Lewis, the manager? Was it the fault of any other person in the management structure of this West Indies team that didn't make clear exactly what their parameters were, that even though they were within the same hotel environment, because they were in separate bubbles and so on, they could not meet, they could not get together in the way that they did. So yes, there's the upbraiding of the players because they are the ones who committed the offense. But as to whether or not it is a situation where they ignored the urgings of the management, or in fact were not informed of the situation that they were in and how easy it was to violate the bubbles that they were in, I suppose that's why there's an investigation. And let's hope it's a proper investigation and we get a real understanding of who's actually culpable.
But that's where skill of communication comes in, Faz, and that's where the lack of skill in communication has now put the players in the invidious position of being cussed out by a public which is always quick to cuss out the players, because the response from Cricket West Indies, it had to be swift, and it was swift, but it makes it seem as if the players blatantly disregarded the letter of the law as read to them by management. And so I find problematic the narrative from Johnny Grave, because it has caused precisely what I've said in the sentence before this one.
I hear you on that, and I understand, because it appears that he's already passed judgment and in holding the players fully responsible. But I also accept that, look, the players need to be mindful of what those restrictions are, and at the end of it all, if they were aware, they were the ones who would have committed the breach. And to be honest with you, from my side, I don't really feel a tremendous amount of anguish or anger about it, because as I said before, for a lot of these players, they've been cooped up for weeks on end. England, into CPL, into New Zealand tour, those coming from the IPL and so on. So there are lots of different issues that are tied in here. And maybe it's just a measure of frustration to just be cooped up for so long. Just look at Virat Kohli, the Indian captain. He hasn't really had to endure a bubble with the exception of this IPL. And already he's complaining about what this bubble could mean going into its series after series. He's going to a tour in Australia where he'll play only one test match and then return for the birth of his child, quite appropriately. But then he won't be going back. So it is a difficult situation. And even if it appears that Johnny Grave might be laying the blame squarely at the feet of the players, that may be so. And even if it is proved to be so, in a way it's understandable. It's just sort of frustration for being cooped up for so long.
Hear you on that. Fazeer Mohammed, thank you very much for your time. All the best to you.
Take care.
Right. And so, based on the information that we have at our disposal, panel, I would suggest that the players may have been hard done by. And I say that acknowledging that there is a lot that we don't know. If it is that the statement had come that the CCTV had caught players going to other players' rooms, and you could identify that Whitaker was going into the room occupied by Chambers and Stewart, or Buchanan was going to the room occupied by Thompson and Blake, then I could say, well, all right, the players knew what they were doing. They were trying to not get caught. But the thing says the players are in the hallways, lounging, sharing food and everything. I'm suggesting that that is indicative of a group of players that did not that were not aware that doing so in this open space was a breach, and that's why I'm saying that it perhaps lies with management, the fault for not reading the letter of the law clearly to the players, which would have caused them to have gone into the situation that we're now discussing now.
But George, when you bring that point up, it worries me because of the fact that it's management that's going to decide what happens moving forward. They are the one carrying out the investigation. I think the manager himself, Raul, has been appointed to conduct this internal investigation. So it brings into question, how is the investigation going to turn out? Is he going, let's just say he's the one to blame, is he going to accept blame for that?
Well, it's a good point you raised. The only saving grace is that even if he conducts the investigation, and perhaps he shouldn't, but even if he does, it will go to an arbiter who is not on tour, i.e. Johnny Grave and the executive of Cricket West Indies, who will have the benefit of looking at the body of evidence collected in the investigation. So they'll hear from the players involved, they'll hear from team captain, vice captain, and Raul Lewis himself to be able to fact find with some amount of objectivity. That's the hope I'm holding out.
Yeah, well, to wrap the segment, I would think that because we have not the full information of what has happened,
yes,
and I really, really would like to get one of the players who have been deemed to have broken the rules to hear exactly what the thought process is. But the information reaching us is that there are two West Indies bubbles, two separate West Indies bubbles. So if I listen to that narrative, it suggests to me that the players understood that they were separated for a reason and they shouldn't be in a mixing of the different bubbles, of the separate bubbles.
But it could have been that the bubbles were separated at the point of the testing. And remember, we are the same ones who've been carrying news that the COVID-19 testing so far has gone off with a hitch. So I'm saying it is natural for the players saying, oh, that bubble is COVID-free, this bubble is COVID-free. There is no injury being caused, no injury accrues by virtue of us mingling. And I'm just saying that based on what we know, it does seem as if maybe management may have dropped the ball in not telling the players that the bubbles should remain distinct, disparate, and separate in every respect.
And I feel like only the players can tell us this. Only the players can let us know what they interpreted from what management said to them.
Yeah. End of the segment. Back with more after this.